Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session entitled Public Debt and Economic Recovery in the MENA region. I'm your moderator for the session. My name is Abla Abdel Latif. I'm the Executive Director of the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies and Director of Research of the same center. I'm obviously from Egypt. I have to say it feels very awkward to be on stage just by myself. I would have loved to have the stage full, and yet it's good to finally have a chance to meet with people and have a live conference, even if it's only hybrid. The entire world was hit by COVID, obviously, but MENA region is always special and different. So the MENA region has been hit hard by COVID, not only in health, but also in economic terms. In order to reduce the severe health and social impact, governments increased their public debt significantly. The average debt level in the region has grown from 46% to 54% of GDP. Combined with decline in fiscal revenues and deterioration of public finances, MENA countries experienced an overall GDP contraction of 3.8% in 2020. Economic prospects, despite some recent improvements, remain rather low, with an expected GDP growth of no more than 2.8% in 2021, in a context of uneven vaccination rates, which risk further weakening growth prospects. In addition, we have the rising energy prices, which are good for some countries and obviously bad for the others, bad for the importers. The pandemic exacerbated long-standing development challenges in the region. Today, additional resources are needed to strengthen the recovery trajectory. Rising debt levels and high servicing costs paired with the necessary fiscal stimulus weigh heavily on public finances, and we have a situation of almost vicious circle of debt and big fear of the region falling in a debt trap, which is very difficult to get out with. This is the core concept of the session. We have four speakers with us virtually. We have Minister Majid bin Abdullah Al-Qasabi, Minister of Commerce in Saudi Arabia. We have Minister Youssef Al-Khalil, Minister of Finance in Lebanon. We have Mr. Farid Belhaj, Vice President for Middle East and North Africa, the World Bank. And we have Mr. Jihad Azur, Director, Middle East and Central Asia Department from the IMF. I welcome all of you. You can see the audience and you are keeping company here, and that feels reasonably warm considering. If we start, we're going to have three questions for each one of you during the session, and for each question, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to answer, and hopefully this is going to cover some of the main issues we have in mind. Let me start with Minister Majid bin Abdullah Al-Qasabi, Minister of Commerce in Saudi Arabia. Economic integration has always been very weak in the region. Okay, and it's one of their economic weakness in general, but a good example is actually the case of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And my question to you is, to what extent has this cooperation helped through the process of COVID and through the process of recovery?
First of all, thank you, Abla, and what a pleasure to be with you today, although we are virtually.
Would have liked to have you live. I mean, it was my plan.
Well, I was planning to, but it's last minute changes because of what was happening anyway. But okay. It gives me a great pleasure and honor to be among such distinguished panel with my colleague from some ministers from various Arab countries and representative from the World Bank and the IMF. As you know, COVID-19 was unprecedented, was invisible, was deadly, was super spreading too fast, and it impacted. It was a tsunami, politically, economically, socially, at all levels. And it was the most disruptor of everything that happens. We've never had this before. So debt is part of it, but the collective impact of this COVID-19 is yet, we have not felt it yet. But going back to answer your question, so I hope that collectively countries will be able to recover and with speed recovery, because life has to go on. And ultimately, we need to create more jobs for our people across the world. And ultimately, that's what will happen. The GCC countries, as an example, was during the pandemic. The government of Saudi Arabia have really took initiatives and have firmly believed that the strong GCC is through the integration. As you say, is none of us as strong as all of us. And alone you can do so little, and together we can do so much. And the real test was through COVID-19. So we have expanded the trade among the GCC countries through reducing cost and reducing.
We lost you. Please unmute.
Yes. Well, I'm sorry, I don't know, but it was unmuted maybe from your end or somebody. Anyway, so the GCC was the geographical location of the GCC, as you know, is unique, as at the crossroads of also between West and East, and we have tried to facilitate the legal and judicial coordination through enhancing our laws, through enhancing our procedures, through attracting foreign investment. So although we are, GCC is strongly integrated, but the MENA economic integration is weak. This is seen and felt through the intra-trade, the inter-regional trade. MENA region have relatively weak trade, only amounting 6% of MENA overall trade, as the World Bank report, between the MENA region. So I think we need to do a lot of structural reform in the MENA region. We need to stop and pause and reevaluate legal procedure. How can we enhance the digital world? As you know, the pattern of today, from e-commerce to e-health to e-education, everything now has been on a digital platform. So in a way, I think we need to have a lessons learned through post-COVID, and then we can go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to you later with questions that are actually more direct to the debt situation in the region and in the role of Saudi Arabia. But let me move on to, for the first question, to Minister Youssef El Khalil, Minister of Finance in Lebanon. Lebanon has suffered significantly lately in economic situation, and COVID definitely did not help. There has been a big drop in GDP in 2020. And I wanted to ask you, Minister Youssef, about the debt situation right now. If you just brief us on where the debt situation is and what is the plan that's being put together right now with the help of the IMF to try and solve the problem.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, as you know, Lebanon has been suffering from a series of crises on the economic level, on the political level, on the health, the COVID issue levels. As you know, the government of Lebanon is entertaining discussions with the IMF as to the possibility of having a successful Jewish program. The situation is a bit, difficult to to handle and necessitates a lot of care. On the one hand, you have seen poverty increasing across the country and affecting serious issues like health, like food intake, like education, and necessitates spending. Of course, for the several past few months, we have had access to the World Bank as to borrowing and executing mainly humanitarian assistance and even financial assistance by providing cash money to the least endowed people. It's only beginning. Time is there. Information is starting to, appliers are starting to interact with the systems. But again, it will need some months before seeing the light as far as execution and as far as distributing aid to the vulnerable, the most vulnerable. So on the one hand, you need money before the World Bank, during the World Bank assistance, and after the World Bank assistance to aid on several levels. And the debt ratio, the fiscal situation does not permit a lot of generosity. And Lebanon in the past has suffered on many occasions of such situations where money was needed and money was printed trying to solve for those problems. And at each and every turnover, it was inflation, sometimes hyperinflation, rather than real support of the needy was concerned. It was deteriorating the situation of people. Lebanon today, I think, by interacting with the various institutions of the country, by interacting with people, with economists and others, is very keen not to make the same mistake, not to get into an over generosity, into printing money and being faced with a more disequilibrated economic situation as far as inflation and the stability of the lira is concerned. So you would see the government today realizing the need to intervene and realizing the lack of fiscal space. The Ministry of Finance and perhaps other institutions as well, but the Ministry of Finance is tackling this issue by creating new revenue for the government. And many improvements can be made there as far as unifying the exchange rates, as far as finding the appropriate or getting back to the appropriate custom duties values, which we hope would generate income to the government so that the government can interact and assist the most needy. I can give you a small example as to the government employees, which in particular have been more suffering than other sectors, the employees and wage earners in other sectors. The private sector is more flexible, almost by definition, I'm so sorry to speak like that, than the public sector. And the private sector for some time has been readjusting as far as treating its employees is concerned, so that they don't witness a lack of interest for people to join in, an increase into migration out of the country, etc., etc., and having the means, since it is interacting with selling goods and services to the private sector. Modest means, but means that are allowing for an improvement into the situation of the wage earners. The public sector was not able to do that, and the public sector needs more finance in order to assist its employees and encouraging them to showing up to work and going back to business as usual.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. We'll come back again to
sure,
Lebanon
sorry,
and the reform efforts.
Yes, sure.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Now, whenever there is a problem in the world, especially with the debt situation, we always say World Bank and IMF, they're supposed to be the saviors. So there is actually quite a bit of a burden on their shoulders. So let's move to Mr. Farid Belhaj, the World Bank. Mr. Farid, what has the World Bank been doing in order to support the MENA region cope with their debt situation? If we are to navigate through what you are doing, what have you done, and what are the areas of focus in your efforts, and which countries? Because I'm sure it's not completely balanced. So please.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Abla. I would have, of course, very much liked to be with you in Rome and enjoying the great city, but unfortunately, we are all stranded wherever we are, and it's a pleasure and honor to be with His Excellency Majid Al-Qasabi and His Excellency Yusuf Al-Khalil, and of course, my very good and old friend Shihad around this table. Let me first say just a quick word, reacting to what Minister Al-Qasabi mentioned. He's absolutely right that at the end of the day, what we need is really more structured and structural reforms in our countries. He mentioned the legal and judicial frameworks, etc. We need to go deep into the issues and not just keep doing some patching up around the margins. So I think that's a very important point, and we need to keep it in mind. So let me give you a couple of numbers first. Jihad and I may not have exactly the same numbers because the definition of the region between the bank and the IMF is slightly different. But be that as it may, we see today that the fiscal deficits in the region are at about 5.2% for MENA as a whole, and 7.1% for all importing countries. So that means what? The fiscal space, the ability to ramp up spending and sustainably to meet needs remains very, very limited. So for MENA, on average, public debt as a share of GDP for 2021 is forecast to decline slightly from 56.3 to 53.6. But these are there is a big oil exporter effect on this one. And as you know, and by the way, a couple of other numbers. For oil importers, we are looking at an increase from 90.4 to 92.3% in 2021. So we are looking at quite a challenge for a number of our countries. And as you may know, the pandemic has had an incredible impact on that. Akin to what could be a natural disaster, even though there haven't been any physical destruction here. Now, you mentioned, what are we doing about it, or what are we suggesting for country to do about it? The cost of elevated debt are likely to manifest themselves eventually, perhaps even in the short term. So countries in the region may have to take action to reduce debt to GDP ratios soon after the pandemic, even if the output is below its potential. What we have recommended for years now is transparency. Debt transparency could very much help aid MENA countries by improving, reporting and monitoring of financial markets vulnerability, and that would, of course, give more trust and confidence into engaging in these countries. Unfortunately, what we see is our evidence suggests that highly indebted countries are more likely to enter into preemptive or post-default restructuring with low growth and weak governance. And this is where we go back to what Minister Al-Qasabi mentioned earlier. The issue of governance and instilling trust is absolutely fundamental. So, what we have tried to do over the last year is adopt I would call that a three-pronged approach. One is, of course, to move as affirmatively as possible into financing all activities related to mitigating the impact of COVID. So whether it is in terms of supplying goods and services, but also very much into financing vaccines. And that is very important. and helped a number of our countries. And by the way, the first country, the whole of the World Bank membership that benefited from our financing of vaccines was Lebanon, and I'm happy to see Minister Yusuf Al-Khail with us today. The second bucket of our engagement was to get into a social safety net approach. So we expanded our social safety nets program all through the region. We have it in Morocco, we had it in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Jordan, in every single country where we felt that there was a need to move ahead on those programs, we put it on the table. I forgot to mention Lebanon as well, where we have a very ambitious program that is still to be implemented, but we very much believe that it is a very important one, because what we saw happening over the last year or year and a half is an increase in poverty, tremendous increase in poverty in a large number of our countries. And this is why we wanted to push this agenda forward. And the third point was to prevent the destruction of the economic fabric of a number of our countries. And this is where we engaged in credit lines and support for small and medium enterprises. So we engaged in a broad conversation with our countries, and we have on that, delivered a number of very ambitious and fast-moving programs. So it is very important that we keep very much in mind not only the fact that we are dealing with a debt crisis that is coming at us very powerfully, if I may say, but at the same time that we are looking beyond this and trying to address the situation in a way that would allow us to, in a way, turn the corner again on health, on poverty, and on making sure that the social fabric of our countries remain as resilient as possible. One more last point that I would make, going back to the issue of making sure that the markets keep their trust in our countries. When one look at the debt composition of a number of our countries, the majority of public debt is domestic, essentially held by domestic banks. Or when it is external, it involves official creditors. So there is a need for us to take a look at that particular angle. We see it today. For instance, some countries in the GCC, Egypt, Morocco, have gone through syndicated banking loans, but the bulk of the stock of the new flow is from domestic and official creditors. I see it very much in Tunisia. I see it very much in a number of other countries. So that too needs to be very much kept in mind. We need to create more fiscal space. This is critical. And for that, more domestic revenue mobilization and boost, again, going back to the first point, boost structural reforms. That is absolutely fundamental at this stage. Thank you so much, Abla.
Thank you. And thank you for saying this, because, I mean, as you correctly mentioned, the issue is not about the debt alone. The debt has always been there, and the reason is, why is the debt there? The debt is there because of previous problems. Things became worse with COVID, but it was always there. So we need structural reform, definitely. Let's move on to the institution that's always in charge when we talk about debt and expected to save the countries, which is the IMF. Mr. Jihad Azur, you've been playing a very important role in trying to ease the burden of the MENA countries, hopefully without sacrificing the economic growth. The question is, or let me ask you briefly, what have you done so far? If you are to navigate through your trip, what have you done so far, and what kind of further assistance is to be offered? You have a huge agenda, so let's just navigate through it quickly to move on to the other questions, please.
Thank you very much, Abla. And let me also, again, thank you for organizing this event, and welcome my friends and colleagues around this virtual table. You have asked two questions: what has been done and what needs to be done. Let me start with the first one. As you rightly mentioned in the introduction of our session, This was a crisis like no other. The region did not witness a crisis like this for the last century. In fact, it was not one crisis, it was a double whammy shock, the COVID-19 and also the volatility in oil price. And therefore, in the beginning, the real issue was how to move and how fast we could move. And therefore, we needed to understand the nature of the crisis. The crisis was an exogenous shock that required immediate support in order to avoid sudden stop. And this is how the fund dealt with the crisis last year by providing a rapid facility. The region got $20 billion of financial assistance in order to help respond to the shock, which was health, humanitarian, and economic shock, but also allow economies not to go into a freeze, and by protecting lives and protecting also livelihoods. In addition to the $20 billion that we provided, which in fact, it's the highest increase in any fund support to the region over the last decades, and even since the creation of the fund. In 2021, with the recovery gaining momentum, yet still weak and uncertain, what we needed to do is to provide additional support for countries in order to navigate this transition, the transition from crisis management to stabilization to recovery. And with that, the instrument that we used was the SDRs. We provided, as you know, globally SDRs to membership, and the region got $45 billion of SDRs. The importance of those SDRs is, on one hand, increase the capacity in terms of reserves, but also allow countries in order to be less dependent when it comes to financing on the movements that we are seeing in the international capital markets. In addition to that, I think what was important is how to synchronize policies. Fiscal, monetary, and financial policies played an important role in navigating, I would say, the first wave of the shock last year. We needed to help countries recalibrate those policies in order gradually to focus on the most needed sectors, address the scarring issues that affected small and medium-sized companies, and also address some of the issues that came with the crisis. The informal sector was more hit than in previous crises. The crisis, in fact, was increased the inequities that existed in the system, especially for youth and women. And we needed to help countries address those issues. And this is why, for example, the financing that was provided was not conditioned on any reform, but conditioned on the way this money is to be spent. Where do we stand today? We have a recovery, and this recovery is bringing us to a growth level that about 4%. It's unfortunately, it's an uneven recovery between countries, but also it's an uncertain because, as we all witnessing, inflation is going up, and especially driven by food and commodity prices, which is the most regressive type of tax on people. And second, we have an uncertainty on the global financial markets. Appreciation of the US dollars, normalization of the monetary policy is putting an additional uncertainty for our countries, which has led several central banks to start hiking interest rates. Therefore, what we need to do now, one, we need to maintain a strong macroeconomic framework. I think my colleagues before me highlighted that. It's important to gradually retrench from the fiscal measures that were introduced, focus them. But here, I think we need to be country specific because countries are different. The recovery, for example, in the GCC was mainly driven by the non-oil sector, thanks to the acceleration of vaccination. Vaccination proved to be an instrumental way of accelerating growth. Therefore, we need to keep protecting lives by maintaining and accelerating vaccination. We need also to understand that monetary policy may also require, with an increase in inflation, some adjustment. And here also the situation changes between countries where we have fixed exchange rate and countries where we have flexible exchange rate. Three, financing. And here we need to distinguish between flows and stock. In the next 2 years, we have almost $1 trillion of financing. Of course, those are aggregate numbers. But here the situation is different between countries who have buffers and those who don't. However, there is two common elements. I think Farid mentioned one, which is the nexus between banks and sovereign. Big chunk of the debt increase was local, and therefore it's very important to deepen the local markets, diversify the funding sources in order to reduce the nexus of relationship between banks and the sovereign. Internationally, although there is still liquidity in the system, but there is a risk that, as we saw in the previous cases, like the taper tantrum in 2014, 2013, and after the global financial crisis, it's very important for countries to, through a medium-term macroeconomic framework, provide additional credibility to any macroeconomic policies. And here it's very important to see greater coordination between monetary policy, central banks, as well as also fiscal agent, which is the ministries of finance. Last on that is we need also to have resources to finance the recovery. We're all banking on a transformative recovery where climate technology will drive growth. And we need growth to come back, because in order to recover the pre-COVID trajectory, we need still to at least 4 or 5 years of growth, but also structural reforms. Minister Al-Kasabi, Farid alluded to them, and Yusuf also. Those are important, and therefore we need to provide additional resources for that. Therefore, we are at one of those very important moments for the region. It's a moment where we have succeeded in dealing with the crisis. We are gradually recovering, yet it's uncertain and it's weak recovery. Therefore, we need to still calibrate our policies. We need to take care of the life of people because of the new variants, and therefore we need to vaccinate. And we need to accelerate the transformation. And here we need to have a transformative recovery. I'm sure that maybe in the second round of discussion, we will go over what are the type of policies that we need and how we as institutions we could have. Before concluding, I would like also to highlight that low income and fragile states were not kept out of this equation. And last year we provided support to Somalia with the debt relief, and this year to Sudan, in addition to the debt relief that we did with the G20 under the chairmanship of the Saudi, who has initiated the DSSI, as well as also with the World Bank, where we had several countries dealing through grants with their debt issue. Let me stop here. Happy to take any other.
Thank you very much. We'll go on now to the second round of questions, but let me start with you again. Okay, so I will not give you a minute to rest, but following up on what you said we need to go back to the pre-COVID trajectory. What we're saying all the time is that we don't want to go back to the pre-COVID trajectory. We want to build back better, because in the MENA region, many of the countries have had serious issues that need addressing: institutional reforms, structural reforms, real addressing to the real side of the economy, industry, agriculture, everything. So these need fixing. So my question to you is, the role of the IMF has been focusing big time, of course, on the debt and on the financials. And you are monitoring seriously in your programs the financial indicators, but you are monitoring less, I think, the other types of reforms. In your programs, there is always an institutional, structural element. There are bits and pieces of the real things. It's not only fiscal and monetary. There are all types of other policies, okay? They are there usually in the program, but in the monitoring of the IMF, they are not looked at very closely by the IMF, and all countries are focusing on, improving the debt situation, improving the financials. So what can you tell me about that, about the specific policy actions that you're pushing, and why isn't the IMF monitoring closely the other reforms? Because these are the ones that will correct the roots of the problem.
Well, Abla, thank you very much for raising this question, because I think there are a lot of some old time perceptions about fund programs. During the COVID crisis, for example, we have adjusted very quickly and recalibrated programs, for example, with countries like Jordan, where we increased the capacity to spend on social. We recalibrated also programs with Egypt, as well as also with other countries. And therefore, the new type of programs are much more, I would say, comprehensive. But here also we have partners. The World Bank and other agencies, EBRD and others, are our partners. And we are, in fact, coming together and coordinating our actions to provide the biggest impact. Here, in terms of fund role, we are very much focused in our engagement on two, I would say, main avenues. One with countries where we have programs, and with countries where we have policy support. In countries where we have programs, we are trying to adjust our programs in order to take into consideration all these elements. Give you a few examples. In the case of Morocco, we have Morocco last year through $3 billion of immediate financing in order to protect what Morocco has introduced in terms of reforms, focusing on how to reduce the brunt on the informal sector, helping the Morocco expand additional financial support to 5 million families who were not part of the formal net. Therefore, programs have been adjusted to take into consideration these elements. Programs have been also adjusted to increase inclusion. And there are several cases whereby, for example, we consider that women participation in the economy is of an utmost priority, not only from an equity perspective, but also from an economic growth. If you reduce the gap, gender gap in the region, you can get over the next 10 years, $1 trillion of additional output. Same year in Jordan, the priority was to reduce the unemployment at the youth level, and therefore the program was designed and calibrated in order to reduce the cost of production and mainly the cost of labor. Therefore, programs are adjusted. Yet it's very important to preserve debt sustainability, because without a sustainable debt, the overall macroeconomic stability is at risk. But also, we need to accelerate a transformative reform. And here we are focusing on three main areas. How to reduce the scarring, because this crisis brought more pressure to high contact intensive sectors. Technology was better protected and recovered faster, and therefore we need to help in this transformation. How to do it? By accelerating the access to finance, access to talent, and access to market. Those are three important elements to help preserve SMEs who also were affected by the crisis. And we consider that between 12 to 25 need restructuring after the crisis. We need to preserve the capacity of banks to lend. And here the investment in digital and new financial instruments in order to increase financial inclusion is very important. And three, we need to open more the room for new sectors. And this would require reforming SOEs to refocus their role and redirect resources to new investment, especially in technology. We saw it in the GCC, the fact that the countries have invested heavily in digital and 5G technology helped in the recovery and helped also in protecting lives. Therefore, we need to invest in that. Climate, which is very important, of course.
Thank you.
We will be supporting others in that, but climate, I'm sure that Farid will talk about that.
Yes,
it's going to be an important sector to work on.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm greedy. I want to ask a lot of questions, and time is sort of short. But thank you very much for this. It's extremely useful, and like I said, IMF is at the heart of the game. Back to you, Mr. Farid Belhaj. Mr. Azur just mentioned the IT sector. IT sector is actually extremely important, and its importance has increased significantly during COVID and in the recovery. To what extent the World Bank, it's actually, double question. To what extent the World Bank has been focusing attention on this? And then on the side, for time consideration, I want to know to what extent the World Bank is starting more to consult with the private sector and with the NGOs in the different countries, because typically the World Bank is always working with the governments, and sometimes what is needed and what needs more focus on the development level and in the recovery level lies with the NGOs and with the private sector. So to what extent are you doing that?
You see, Abla, this is one of those preconceived ideas that we don't consult. As a matter of fact, we spend a lot of our time and energy and engagement consulting with everybody, civil society, academia, and all walks of societies in the region, in the countries in which we are working. And I can elaborate on that, but let me focus on a couple of issues. One, if I may, Jihad mentioned the role of the state in the economy in the Middle East and North Africa region. The role of the state in the economy in our region is unfortunately overwhelming, and it in many instances thwarts the the capacity for the private sector to develop all of its potential. And this is where I believe that having a frank conversation with each one of the countries in which we are working is very much on top of our priorities. And I was in Morocco a few days ago, and the whole discussion was precisely on that. And I see that same conversation happening in each one of our countries. Let me make another point. This whole issue of COVID that came and hit us all is in a number of countries is being seen or used by a number of the decision makers as some kind of an alibi. COVID is pushing us back into et cetera, et cetera. As a matter of fact, pre-COVID issues and problems and constraints are, I would say, more important than what came after COVID. So pre-COVID, as a matter of fact, made the COVID, the impact of COVID even worse than what could have been managed. I take one example, for instance, your own country, Egypt, has done a number of very powerful and far-reaching reforms in 2014, 15, 16, etc. Well, today we see the positive outcome of those reforms. In spite of COVID and in spite of everything else, Egypt is still, one of the very few, if not the only country that has delivered positive growth over the last year, and is doing relatively okay, as to be contrasted with other countries. So going about reforms, as was mentioned from the very beginning, is absolutely key to what we are doing. And one issue that we have been discussing over the last few months: how can we, as a Middle East and North Africa region, avoid another lost decade? After what was called the Arab Spring, everybody jumped up and down and said, this is a new era. Well, unfortunately, 10 years later, what we see is a large number of our countries getting into even more problems than we had possibly before that. So how can we work our way through a new decade that would be more promising? And this is where, again, structural reform would be absolutely fundamental. So one of the main reforms that we are looking at is obviously digital transformation. And it has become a reality in MENA when with COVID-19 and physical distancing measures became part of our daily life. So we pushed that agenda. A number of governments were forced to shift towards a more virtual world through digital platforms and service delivery. But just to tell you, we've started before COVID, opening up, and we launched what we called at the time the MENA moonshot, to try to shake up a bit, a region that is unfortunately lagging when it comes to connectivity and lagging when it comes to integration. So we pushed that agenda, and we are looking and working with a number of our countries, notably through central banks, when it comes to digital inclusion and financial inclusion using the digital economy. What I'm looking at in MENA today is an increased frustration by young people looking at a future that is basically blocked. There is a number that have been floating over the last 3 or 4 years. By 2050, in the Middle East and North Africa region, the way we see it, between Morocco and Iran, we will be looking at more than 300 million young people knocking at the door of the job market. 300 million people, almost the population of MENA today. And these jobs shall not, we know it, be created by the public sector. And this is where, pushing an engagement and opening to the private sector becomes strategic. As I mentioned, I was in Morocco last week. When I look at Morocco, which is one of the most successful stories in the whole of MENA, I'm looking at a country that is growing at about 2.5%, 3%, maybe 3.5%, and has been kind of doing that for the last very many years. When Morocco's potential would be way higher than that. The delta between where Morocco is today and what Morocco could achieve in terms of potential is what is absolutely needed to fill, so that Morocco can absorb, the number of young people looking for
Absolutely.
a job today. So
Absolutely.
I'll finish with this. We need to really be extremely ambitious in our engagement and not take what is put on the table for us with very slow growth and not enough reforms. We need to move reforms so that we can make sure that those hundreds of millions of young people get a job and get a possibility for a brighter future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Back to you, Minister Youssef Al-Khalil in Lebanon. The youth, okay, we were just talking about the youth and how difficult the situation is in all countries in the MENA region. In Lebanon, we have on top also the poverty levels, very serious poverty level in all dimensions. What is being done about that? And I'm going to be asked you to be a bit brief, because my time control is not doing a very good job, but please, I'm sorry, my mistake, but go ahead.
You've been great. It's our mistake. I mean, my mistake when I overspoke. The issue of the youth in the Arab world is an important issue, has always been the case, especially over the past 50, 60 years. Perspective, focusing on efficient education at all ages, and at all the ages prepare our youth for new technologies, for access to the market. Since I agree so much with Mr. Berhaj, the government has failed into invested. So in Lebanon, we don't have a problem of high population growth rates because of various factors that determine growth rates, population growth that is. But we still have a relatively young population, perhaps less than.
The line is cracking.
So we need to focus on education, access to new technology, digitization, as all of my colleagues have been proposing, and have it as inclusive as possible. Thank you.
What are the key actions you're doing to deal with poverty?
I think what we I think the government of Lebanon, and after agreeing with the IMF, in parallel to the agreement with the IMF, would have to focus on a new way of seeing things. I mean, the projects that will be adopted, hopefully, would have to be very inclusive. And by that, proposing a new way of doing things in Lebanon. Inclusion is very, very important and must be sought continuously in all kinds of projects that the government would be contemplating. Sustainability is the other characteristic of the projects we would be encouraging or implementing. The Lebanese have suffered historically from opting for projects that were not sustainable, that if you wish, proposed or promised 5, 6, 7 years of positive change, and would stop delivering that during the first year. And the third characteristic that has to be applied is governance. As you know, the public sector and institutions in general have suffered and are still suffering from a lack of confidence. So governance has to prove itself into implementing all kinds of projects from now on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Back to Saudi Arabia, Minister Al-Qasabi. What has Saudi Arabia, or what can Saudi Arabia do for its neighboring Arab countries in the MENA region to help them with the debt and with the economic recovery? If you give us, suggestions on what can be done, would not beyond the GCC. I'm talking about the others.
Yes.
Your neighbors.
Abla, if I may just a quick comment on the previous question. I think on my colleagues' remarks, if we look at today, 8 countries, I don't know how many countries today, 193 countries globally, 8 countries only, China, India, Japan, France, Germany, UK, Spain, and the United States. 8 countries consist 50% of the global population, as well as 62% of the global GDP.
Yes.
What I think what we need to identify our global future true north. Where are we heading? We need to have a global trade book. It's no longer local or national or GCC or European Union. We need to agree, because what's happening, we have a lot of headwinds today between countries, and a lot of people suffer, and especially the MENA region. This is one. So I would suggest that we should have a global roadmap, a global vision in this. Coming back with Saudi Arabia has been always a prominent and a forklift in terms of development and investment and humanitarian aids. For example, just some figures for you. We have the Saudi Development Fund only since inception have reached to 84 countries, have given $93 billion, and have some of 2/3 of it is loans and 1/3 almost aids, and during the COVID-19, we have prepared the plan to reach out and give 30 countries and almost 20 in Africa with a volume of $830 million in terms of vaccination and health aid and facility aid. Saudi Arabia can play, one, an investment forklift, private sector as well as government, as PIF, two, humanitarian aid, and third, the private the Saudi Development Fund and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. For my last minutes here, because this thing turns red, it's very scary from where I am to see the clock. For my last question for all 4 of you, it's the same question, really, and very briefly, in like 50 seconds. What do you see as the top priority action that needs to be taken in the region so as not to slip into that trap? Everything that was said has to be done, important, etc., etc. What would be the top priority action? And I'll start with you, Mr. Qasabi.
I think one is it has to be in parallel. There is nothing in. They have to start structural reform, spending efficiencies, diversification of income, leveraging their human resources and natural resources, and connecting globally.
Thank you very much. Minister Khalil. Unmute, please. We can't hear you.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I would say education again, access to new technology, access to finance for the young generation who would like to go into business, SMEs, and that. And I would add environmental issues, the environment, caring about the environment to assure a sustainable status in all of our countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Belhaj.
Yes, since the question is very precise, I would say that in order to address an ill, you need to identify it. So debt transparency would be absolutely fundamental so that we know what we are dealing with and we can address it and make the right adjustments.
Thank you. Mr. Azur.
Thank you very much. Coming at the end, it's very difficult.
You have to be at the end.
To add to what
others
have said, I concur to what has been said. I would say very quickly 3 things. Learn quickly from the crisis in order to avoid what we did in the past, to do too little too late. Second, it's a transformative recovery. It cannot be business as usual. And it has to be done in a way that we need to go beyond the classical cycle management, which means a new social model is in the making, a new social compact, as well as also new approach of regional cooperation. You have raised, Abla, the question of regional cooperation. Yes, there is future for it, maybe not in the organical approach that it used to be in the past, very pyramidical. It has to be now on topics, on issues. I see science, I see technology, I see climate. I see now with the labor reforms that we saw over the last couple of years in the GCC, I see it through technology. Technology played an important role to provide the lifeline of remittances. Therefore, I see new future for regional integration, not in the old format, but in a new format. The economy globally is going to shift after this crisis. We need to be part of it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Definitely, regional integration is key. The entire world is in the same boat with this crisis. One of the silver lining that we have to collaborate. I learned a lot during this session. I hope that it was beneficial for you. What is clear is that the problems have existed before the crisis. The issue of debt is not a new thing. All countries need to have the institutional, the structural reforms in order to correct the problem from its core. Okay, transparency about the debt, education, the youth, taking care of the real side of the economy are all key things. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the distinguished panelists. And thank you for the lovely audience here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Bazo? Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Perfect. Sorry for the inconvenience about the link. This was the right one.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was waiting on the other one for
No,
like
don't
the
worry.
last